Thank you for coming to join us to celebrate the many contributions of Peter Gordon over an extremely distinguished career. Peter is not only a deeply respected scholar and educator, he's also a very dear colleague and friend to all of us in this room. It's really an honor to have this opportunity to spend a little time to recognize him formally on the occasion of his retirement from the university. Alan, a creditor, was just telling me that he thinks it's been over 40 years, but we won't dwell on that part. Peter has had an incredible impact through his scholarly research as well as his professional work, and Professor Jim Moore and our guest speaker will say more about that in their talks. For my remarks, I'd like to focus on Peter's many service and educational contributions. His dedication to our students and his administrative leadership have truly helped mold our school into the excellent, outstanding institution that it is today. So let's start from the beginning. Peter received his bachelor's degree in economics from UCLA, and I took out the year. He received his MA here at USC in economics, and then he went on to get his PhD in regional science from the University of Pennsylvania, after which he joined the faculty, and Alan said that you were the dean at that time, so Alan hired Peter as a junior faculty member here at the school. During his career, Peter has held many leadership posts. He served as Associate Dean of the former School of Urban and Regional Planning, and then he served as Dean of the school when Alan Creditor became the Senior Vice President for Advancement. In this former role, Peter was instrumental in facilitating the growth of the planning faculty. He worked closely with Alan and to hire individuals who have today become some of the most prominent faculty members in our school, and they include Professors Jen Giuliano, Eric Hakela, Martin Krieger, Jim Moore, Dal Myers, and David Sloan. So you can, just through that list, see the impact that he's had on the school. He also has overseen many of the academic programs in the school, including the Master of Planning, the Master of Real Estate Development, the undergraduate degree in Planning and Development, and the PhD in Planning. And after the schools of Public Administration and Planning merged in 1998, Peter again offered up his leadership, and he served again as the director of the MRed degree program. And from my own experience, Peter has been very ready and able to serve when needed. When we needed a one-year MRed director in 2008, Peter stepped in again to lead the program and did really an outstanding job, including building a stronger community among the faculty, the adjunct faculty, the students, and the alumni. And I had the privilege of participating with Peter in some of those meetings, and they were really quite dynamic. Ambitious as ever, however, Peter, during this one-year leadership of this program, proposed to the dean that the program double its size of its admitting class and admit 2 cohorts rather than 1, so that we would admit maybe 75 or 80 students a year, as the program has indeed shown significant growth over the prior 5 years. But like virtually every other prominent economist of the time, and showing that Peter, even though great, is not perfect, he failed to foresee the impending housing bubble and the financial crisis, which unfortunately caused our MRed student enrollments to go in the opposite direction. But I think, Peter, you'll be gratified to know that we are now recovering from this downturn and doing very well again. As a professor and dedicated educator, Peter has also nurtured generations of students, preparing them to succeed long after they have left USC. His students hold faculty positions in universities around the world, and I've experienced this myself because I've traveled and visited universities, and Peter is well known as a faculty member not only here in the United States but in several other universities in Asia in particular. And several of these people are now leaders in these universities as well. In addition, others of Peter's students have established themselves as prominent practicing professionals. And so he has an amazing distinguished legacy of his multiple students in and outside the university. Peter has really profoundly shaped the legacy of our school. His commitment, his hard work, and his leadership have benefited greatly the Price School, USC, and society. And Peter, I personally want to thank you for offering your valuable time and your multiple talents in the advancement of our school. Your contributions have had an invaluable impact on so many. Thank you very much.
All right, so I've worked with Peter since 1987, which is when I came to USC, so it's just about 26 years. I'd say roughly half of anything I've published, Peter's touched some way, either as a co-author or helping me avoid mistakes or in some similar capacity. I'm not the person who's worked with him the longest. That individual is Harry Richardson, so I reached out to Harry for some thoughts about the body of work that they've done together. They've worked together for 38 years, ever since 1975. So my remarks combine his point of view and mine. His commitment to teaching, particularly USC PhD students, has been just fabulous. I mean, his commitment's been great at all levels, but he's particularly effective with PhD students. And he's got this rather refined instructional style, and I don't even know if he does this or not. I've not discussed it with him. But a lot of what he writes and a lot of what he says is really fundamentally syllogistic. Major premise, minor presence, conclusion. Because he knows that listeners who reach the conclusion he's trying to lead them to themselves are more apt to believe it and to understand it. That almost always works. It doesn't inevitably work because the simple truth is some people are just have an inborn immunity to logic. But it worked for the most part on me, right? And one of the great advantages of having a colleague like Peter is that it allows the faculty he works with, certainly me as a junior faculty member, to continue my education beyond graduate school. And my university education continues to a large extent because of the way Peter helped integrate me into this organization. One of the more interesting comments that I think have been made about Peter is that he's an oxymoron and that he's a libertarian planner. And there are some members of the community, local and less local, who have actually called him anti-planning. I don't really think that bothers him because the simple truth is that there is nothing more productive from a scholarly point of view than getting into an argument in print. And Peter has attracted more than his share of attention to the institution and is a thought leader in the areas in which he publishes. He's had a long-standing focus on sprawl. He's been writing in that area since 1997. Sprawl is a somewhat pejorative term. You might more logically refer to it as the obvious net benefits of suburban and exurban development. As a result of his long-standing scholarly contributions, well, he and Harry together account for about half of all of the citations in Google Scholar among USC planning faculty, and as a result, the USC planning operation is ranked second nationally in terms of faculty citations. And so I watch Peter's departure with some trepidation and hope that he'll continue to publish, and hopefully he'll continue to publish with me because I need all of the help I can get. Further, Peter really does accept some planning interventions. And you feel free to correct anything that you disagree with. But so long as the planning interventions are structured in a way that respect markets, that provide market incentives and disincentives for behavior, I mean, he's willing to reach in and twist the knobs a little bit and adjust the social fabric, but he wants to do so in a way that really fundamentally respects how economics works and how people are going to behave in an economic context. He's done some surprisingly computational work over the years. I mean, I've watched him as he has attempted to put together a thought paradigm that would explain as much as possible. And he's dallied with computation, analytics, all sorts of mathematical modeling, statistics. He's actually rather accomplished in these arenas. But he seems to have come down fundamentally on economics. Now, one of the upsides of all of these forays into these various areas to try to find an approach that would answer as many questions as possible is he's been able to work with so many excellent doctoral students. And we've mentioned, Jack's referred to the number of lives he's touched in that dimension, but it includes Chang-Hee Bai at the University of Washington, and Ji-Young Park, who's at SUNY Buffalo, and Qishang Pan, who's at in Houston, Texas Southern in Houston, thank you. Bum-Soo Lee, who's at Urbana-Champaign. The list goes on. And that's just a partial domestic list. Yo-Yo Fan at UC Davis, right? I mean, you can, if you go international, the list gets very long very quickly, and if you count the people who are in agencies, both nationally and locally, internationally and locally, the list becomes enormous, and several of them are here today. I'm going to stop, but I will point out that Peter is a near fanatical supporter of Friedrich Hayek's ideas. Scratch that, he is an unabashedly fanatical supporter. Those ideas often show up in what he writes. He's a voracious reader. He reads a lot, he shares what he finds. I was at the USC gift store, which used to be the USC bookstore. And I found what I think is a reasonably fresh copy of T.C. Boyle's short stories too. So it's not quite hot off the presses. And I tried to get him to sign it, but he doesn't know who I am, so he didn't. Anyway, it's up here. If you want to read about something besides the stuff you're constantly sending to me, something a little bit more fun, this would be good. This is a good place to start. Punchline's this. Peter's one of the few people I know whose scholarship is so fundamentally about understanding the world, and who is so intellectually honest that he's able to integrate his worldview with his teaching. I mean, he lives it. This isn't the job, this is what he is, it's what he does. And so, don't be a stranger. That's it. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, all the co-conspirators who've been involved in this wonderful event. I'm supposed to say I'm humbled, and then I'm told that that's what everybody said at the Academy Awards. All these winners said I'm humbled, and then the retort was, how can these stars be humbled? And you can equally say, how can professors be humbled, right? How does that really work? It took some time. It took many years for me to figure out that there are perhaps more enlightening ways to think about cities and talk about cities. As Jim mentioned, that's when I became interested in the work of Ronald Coase, F.A. Hayek, Jane Jacobs. And once I'd figured that out, I found there's a guy who'd been doing this all along, and that's our speaker, Sandy Ikeda. So I was late to the party, so to speak, but I'm happy I met Sandy when I did. Sandy, I've written a couple of papers together, and whenever I talk to Sandy, I learn something, which is really what it's all about. So when Jen was kind enough to say to me, you know, let's invite somebody who you would want to invite, you know, I went down the list. You know, Paul Krugman is busy, Milton Friedman is dead, and Sandy's available. So here he is. So anyway, I appreciate all of this very much. Thank you. I'm humbled, and thank you, Sandy, for joining us.
Before I begin my formal lecture, I just want to say thank you, Peter, for bestowing this honor on me. I'm thrilled to be able to do it, and before this audience, thank you all for coming out and arranging for me to come out. Appreciate it very much. So if I may say a few personal things before I get to my formal remarks, which I hope you'll bear with me. I plan to read because I couldn't memorize the whole thing. But I'd like to say a couple things. I got to know Peter not too long ago, it's been 10 or 12 years or so, I invited him, not having met him, to participate in a symposium for a journal that had to do with urban economics and Austrian economics, and which brought in Hayek and others. And so I knew him that way. And then later, when I was working with the Mercatus Center of George Mason University, we were doing a study of post-Katrina recovery. And I went down a list of people that I thought I would like to work with, and Peter's name stood out. Again, not having met him. And it's interesting because we started working on this particular paper. I went down to New Orleans, Mississippi, and looked around, and he went down separately. And so we started writing, and for the first month or so, we got so far, but we just really wasn't connecting. And I finally got really frustrated, so I hopped on a plane from New York and came here for a weekend. I think I came in, what was it, Friday night, and I left Sunday morning or something. And in that, 36 hours, we got more done in just that period of time than we had in 4 or 5 weeks. It was this really brought home the importance of face-to-face contact and the personal dimension. Peter said that he has learned from me, but that seems to be a motto with him, and it's something that I learned from him, that do a project if you expect to learn something from it, right? Why do it otherwise? Don't do it for status, for prestige, or, but do it because you think you're going to learn something from it. And that kind of stuck with me. What I learned from Peter is, well, for one thing, we're kind of, even though we're very much on the same wavelength in terms of our appreciation for people like Coase and Hayek, we're almost like opposites attracting. I tend to be very kind of conceptual and abstract and have my head in the clouds, and Peter is, well, compared to me, much more of a empirical economist, and so that alone was interesting, trying to work together with him. Then also, he works fast. I guess what would happen, I would work for 3 or 4 days trying to grind out a draft of paper, or actually he would send me something, and then I would spend 3 or 4 days trying to respond to it. I'd send it off exhausted, 8 o'clock in the morning. 4 o'clock in the afternoon comes the next version. And so I don't even have a day to relax, and I'm already working on the revisions, and it just went back and forth like it was very inspiring, I must say. Interestingly enough, Peter, we don't see eye to eye on the importance of density and economic development. It's one of the areas where we kind of disagree. So what do? We write a paper together called "Does Density Matter?" And somehow we were able to find some common ground, and it actually caught the eye of Richard Florida, who liked it very much. But anyway, I just want to say that it's been wonderful knowing you. I hope we continue to collaborate in the future. I know you're not going to sit still, and I look forward to that and learning from you as long as I can. So my talk is a line from Jane Jacobs's book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she says, a city cannot be a work of art. And this is the quote that comes directly after that. All right, so the title of my talk comes from a passage, and the lines immediately following it read as follows. Artists, whatever their medium, make selections from the abounding materials of life and organize these selections into works that are under control of the artist. The essence of the process is disciplined, highly discriminatory selection from life. In relation to the inclusiveness and the literally endless intricacy of life, art is arbitrary, symbolic, and abstracted. And it continues. To approach a city, or even a city neighborhood, as if it were a larger architectural problem, capable of being given order, by converting it into a disciplined work of art, is to make the mistake of attempting to substitute art for life. The results of such profound confusion between art and life are neither art nor life. They are taxidermy. So, how do we avoid turning urban design into taxidermy? I think the short answer is that we avoid it by recognizing that there's a trade-off between the scale of a design and the degree of spontaneity, complexity, and intricacy in the resulting social order that the design allows. Now, saying that a city cannot be a work of art does not mean, of course, that a city cannot be beautiful or that deliberate design can never enhance that beauty. But I do suggest that the beauty that is designed as a work of art is fundamentally different from the undesigned beauty that comes from a lifetime of experience. A skillfully made-up face is beautiful in a way quite different from the beauty in the face of a 91-year-old grandmother. And I'm not saying that small is always beautiful either. What I am saying is that mega or giga projects are more beautiful the farther away from them you are. While living cities are usually best experienced up close on the street. But before I get too far over my head in aesthetics, I believe that Jacobs, in asserting that a city cannot be a work of art, was thinking less about aesthetics per se than about the problem of social order, about the complexities of social cooperation among strangers. Jacobs argued that also that a city cannot be a work of science or engineering for essentially the same reasons that it cannot be a work of art. Both the engineering perspective and the aesthetic perspective abstract from an organic whole. Both substitute the vision of a single mind for the intricacies of a system that is the result of many minds. These reasons parallel those of F.A. Hayek, who warned of the dangers of conflating planned orders for unplanned or spontaneous orders. Similarly, the economist Richard E. Wagner draws the same distinction in his contrast between piazza and parade. I have a picture of a piazza, people following their own plans. Piazza. Here's another one of my favorite piazzas in Siena. Versus orderly parade that looks good from a distance. As we all know, Jacobs was harshly critical of highly centralized, heavy-handed 1950s style planning. We need look no further for examples than Brasilia, or indeed what's going on right now in China's so-called ghost cities. She was no less critical of urban theory, the paradigm of Lewis Worth's model of a city as a three-variable problem: population, density of settlement, and degree of heterogeneity, with which he argued it was possible to, quote, explain the characteristics of urban life and to account for the differences between cities of various sizes and types. In contrast, Jacobs saw a living city as a problem of what she called organized complexity, which involves, quote, dealing simultaneously with a sizable number of factors which are interrelated into an organic whole. Her working definition of a city was that of a settlement that generates its own economic growth from its own local economy. So her definition of a city is one that comes from economics or is economically based. Much more congenial to her way of thinking were the design theories of Kevin Lynch or William H. White or Jan Gehl, or the novel traffic policies of shared space that is spreading across Northern Europe today, all of which pay careful attention to what real people do and how they interact with each other and with the built environment. Now, what about those trade-offs? First of all, Jacobs observed that the artist abstracts from life with all its inclusiveness and literally endless intricacy. Many architects, especially those with great ambition, seem to treat urban environments as merely a picture frame for their works of genius. The good ones try to take into account how they fit or don't fit into the existing built environment and how real people might actually use them. But whether you're an architect or an economist, predicting how people will respond to a change is a pretty iffy thing, and the scale of the change matters a lot. One of the things economists learned from the 20th century debate over collectivist central planning, the so-called socialist calculation debate, is that the optimal level of central planning is relatively low. The local knowledge that makes things work is beyond the grasp of the central planner, and accounting for incentives is problematic. And the more she tries to design a social order, the more people will strive to adjust to her interventions in unforeseen ways, thwarting her intentions. In the context of urban design, that means that substituting the genius of the planner for the collective genius of ordinary people diminishes the intricacy, complexity, and yes, the beauty of the resulting social order and generates negative unintended consequences. The larger and more elaborate a design is in relation to the social space it's trying to fit into, the narrower will be the scope of unplanned activities that it can permit. That's because the structure of any scale and detail of design necessarily constrains to some degree how people will use it and the space around it. Building a mid-sized townhouse within a commercial block changes the character of the rest of the block and perhaps also the surrounding neighborhood. The bigger the structure, the bigger the change will be. In addition, constructing something that takes up an entire city block, like the Empire State Building, pardon me, all my examples come from New York City, not only limits what people can do in and around the space, but also challenges the designer to try to account for how people will want to use it. Scaling up is something like Lincoln Center or Hudson Yards exponentially increases the difficulty of predicting people's behavior in and around that space, and of constraining how they will actually use it. If she wants to preserve the potential for unplanned liveliness, the designer will need to leave substantial room for adjustment over time. Otherwise, the level of social complexity will be limited by her imagination at that point in time. A city can handle endless waves of complex, ongoing problems if the rules that govern interaction and the spaces where people interact in allow many minds to discover those problems and to work on them over time. Good urban design, therefore, ought to take seriously into account a city's invisible infrastructure, i.e. the patterns of contact, use, and ever-changing networks that promote order and social cooperation, that enable individuals to harness their local knowledge. Construction should complement emergent order, not try to replace it with deliberate design. It's a mistake to approach building structures as different in scale as the Empire State Building, Lincoln Center, or Hudson Yards as one of mere degree. With respect to their impact on the invisible social infrastructure, they are different in kind. Increasing the scale of design/construction cuts ever more deeply into the living flesh of a city. The challenge of the designer/builder of public space then is to enable rather than replace the spontaneous low-level planning of ordinary people and to preserve, largely by keeping away from, the action spaces where informal contact and networking, trial and error, diversity, and discovery usually happens. Too often, scaling up progressively drains the life and intelligence from a city. So what do these trade-offs look like? We can visualize the trade-off between the scale of design and the complexity and spontaneity of a social order as a downward sloping curve, a sort of scale order possibilities frontier. In addition to order, complexity on the one hand and scale on the other, a third element I would like to add to the trade-off is the passage of time. You can, to some extent, plan for complementarity, but you can't really plan for spontaneous complexity and intricacy. Fortunately, time allows people, to some extent, to adjust social networks and physical spaces to better complement their own plans in ways that the designer could not have foreseen. That is, for any given scale, time lets people figure out novel uses for or changes to the space as originally designed. Those unthought of uses constitute an increase in the level of complexity in a spontaneous order. Over time, then, the frontier can shift outward. And I have a little picture of that. So figure 1 reflects these relations. The scale of a structure and the designed or planned uses of the space within that structure are, of course, two different things. To keep things simple, Figure 1 treats scale in the design as highly positively correlated. So I'm just looking here at scale. Thus, as scale increases, so do the designed elements, and together they decrease the potential for spontaneous order. It's a trade-off. As time passes, the frontier shifts up from AB to A prime B, where point B represents the case where the structure occupies 100% of the relevant action space. So for any given scale, the passage of time increases the potential level of spontaneous order. How far it might shift in a given time period and the particular shape of the trade-off are critical issues, but unfortunately they are beyond what I can discuss here. But thinking of the relation between scale, order, and time in this way can still help to explain how, despite the monumental scale of ancient Rome or Haussmann's Paris or Niemeyer's Brasilia, or perhaps even California's Irvine, time has made those places more livable. Now, what about the impact of deliberate design itself on spontaneous order? Figure 2 isolates design from scale. It depicts a possible trade-off between the potential for spontaneous order, again on the vertical axis, on the one hand, and the degree to which the order in the structure is planned rather than unplanned, so the degree of design. While I believe a space in which there is no deliberate overall design can still give rise to spontaneous order all the way to the origin, I have drawn the curve emanating from the origin, that is, no overall design, no spontaneous order, but I've drawn the curve rising steeply at first to reflect my own priors. Just a little bit of planning goes a long way. It then reaches a maximum level of potential spontaneous order at D star, beyond which design begins to substitute for rather than complement complement unplanned order. So precisely because it is not a work of art, not the result of deliberate design, a city can achieve astonishing intricacy, or Jacobs's organized complexity. But it is not a work of art. But if it is not a work of art, then what is a city? I've been using the term spontaneous order, but what is that exactly? A spontaneous order, as I'm using the term here, is a set of stable relations or patterns that is the result of human action but not of human design. It has the property of emergence, which is the ability of a complex system to arise from a multiple of individual interactions and to adapt to changing conditions. Many of you are not familiar with the concept of spontaneous order, so let me briefly explain its relationship to man-made or artificial structures on the one hand and natural structures on the other. For example, a computer versus a tree. One is man-made, designed from the ground up, built consciously step by step. The tree, for the most part, has no human intervention responsible for its growth. Consider language. Language certainly is the result of human action. After all, people speak language. It would not exist but for people. But to say that someone invented language, or even specific languages like English or Danish or Japanese or Korean, is absurd. Language is the result of the interaction of a multitude of people over time. It has evolved in a way that no one planned, designed, or could have foreseen. So spontaneous order is neither artificial, that is man-made, or natural. It represents a category of its own. And that's what markets are, and that indeed is what a living city is. So like Jacobs, I see cities as highly adaptive systems that can achieve a level of complexity and orderly dynamism well beyond anything anyone could impose by design. Cities are the result of human action, but for the most part, not of human design. They are largely emergent, self-regulating, and self-sustaining. I say largely, of course, because sometimes a city starts out as a deliberate creation. But over time, it evolves in ways that no one who played a part in its deliberate construction could have foreseen. The original designers of New York City's subway system in the late 19th century could not possibly have accurately predicted how the network would evolve over the next 100 years. And the ambitious public megaprojects undertaken at various points in a city's history, such as Haussmann's Paris, are eventually absorbed into the urban matrix. A city outgrows the elements designed at its beginnings or later. The living flesh of a city heals, but no one knows just how. Like the spontaneous orders of language, judge-made law, and culture, cities evolve in response to a myriad of impulses from the people who constitute them. Cities thrive when there is freedom in one's voluntary interactions with others. When they flourish, cities draw together socially distant strangers who are seeking profit, however they might interpret that word. And as Hayek explained in The Use of Knowledge in Society, because people with limited knowledge can use the money prices that emerge from countless market exchanges as signals, the market process is much smarter than any human mind. In exactly the same way, the collective intelligence of a city can solve problems that no one can solve by herself. Even more importantly, cities serve to make us aware of what those problems are in the first place. Now, it's true that some of these problems would not have existed but for large numbers of people with diverse knowledge, skills, and tastes packing themselves together in dense agglomerations. But these are also the conditions that foster informal contact. They make cities incubators of ideas and the principal sources of cultural and scientific innovation. Innovation and creativity are not possible without experimentation, trial and error. And trial and error is characteristically messy and often dangerous. Even though the number and diversity of opportunities you find in a city significantly lowers the uncertainty and cost of experimenting, failure and disappointment will always be part of the bargain. Life on the cutting edge is the price and the value of living in a dynamic social order. Rem Koolhaas put it well when he said, "The entire spectacle defines the dark side of metropolis as an astronomical increase in the potential for disaster, only just exceeded by an equally astronomical increase in the ability to avert it. Manhattan is the outcome of that neck-and-neck race." This is from Delirious New York, excuse me. That, of course, could be said of any living city. A city is the unintended consequence of people following their own plans, their own dreams. And when free to do so, they will shape and abide by norms, conventions, beliefs, and institutions, i.e. the rules of the game that promote social cooperation and create wealth in ways no one can fully imagine. And their choices will also intentionally or unintentionally nudge those norms, conventions, and the rest in unpredictable directions. That is, as long as they are free to do so. Freedom here means the ability to break old, strong ties and to make new, weak ties. All that making and breaking, like all change, entails some amount of disappointment, even tragedy. But the payoff, the bright side of metropolis, is creativity and innovation. In that sense, innovation and disappointment, creativity and conflict go hand in hand. Trying to eliminate the dark side, to put a stop to unwanted change, or imposing rules to avoid disappointment, stifles creativity and results in even more profound disappointments. In other words, taxidermy. As long as ordinary people are free to apply their intelligence, knowledge, energy, and resourcefulness where they see the opportunity to do so, the forces of creation will stay just ahead of the gales of destruction. People will adjust to or change the built environment, or more importantly, they will adjust to or change the invisible social infrastructure. But then, amidst all this change and motion, how can we tell when things are getting better or worse? Before we can correct what we think is wrong with the city, we need an appropriate standard of what is right. The standard of rightness, in turn, depends on our understanding how the thing we're trying to fix is supposed to work. In this regard, I'm afraid neither standard macroeconomics nor microeconomics is much help at all. In traditional macroeconomics, too much important detail is lost in its preoccupation with aggregates and averages. For example, standard macroeconomic theory treats capital as homogeneous, and so makes no distinction between a hammer and a harbor. except that a harbor may be equivalent to many, many hammers. Such an approach is too blunt an instrument for getting to the level of detail needed to appreciate the complex time structure of capital of an economy, let alone tell us what would be necessary to promote that structure. The limitations of standard microeconomics are in some sense even more severe. Efforts to make cities run more efficiently, for example, when efficient means something more than simply the way I want to see things done, run up against a deep conceptual problem. Strictly speaking, an action is efficient when a person achieves a given end with the least costly of all available means. In other words, if you know what the most valuable end that you should be pursuing is, and if you know what the correct value of each of the possible means to achieve that end are, then your choices have a very good chance of being efficient. It would simply be a matter of matching the known least cost means to the known highest valued ends. But if you lack knowledge of any part of that ends means framework, if your knowledge is not perfect, it would be impossible to tell whether any particular ends means combination is efficient or inefficient. You can't compare a given outcome with an ideal outcome if you don't know what the ideal outcome might be. Efficiency might be appropriate in Lewis Wirth's three-variable city, but useless in a Jacobsian system of organized complexity. The starting point of Jacobs, or of Hayek, or of my great professor Israel Kirzner, is that a person is aware of only a small portion of the total amount of information she needs for the successful completion of her plans. Also, people make mistakes. Plans conflict. Again, the social processes in cities are precisely what facilitate the discovery of conflicts and errors, as well as harness the knowledge needed for their resolution. Real markets are never efficient, and neither are real cities. But the good news is that, given the nature of the trial and error process, we wouldn't want them to be efficient. As Jacobs put it, but I propose to argue that these grave and real deficiencies are necessary to economic development and thus are exactly what make cities uniquely valuable to economic life. By this, I do not mean that cities are economically valuable in spite of their inefficiency and impracticality, but rather because they are inefficient and impractical. To someone trained in standard economics, that sounds paradoxical. If you understand why a city cannot be a work of art, however, it's common sense. A living city works by effectively combining what I call the 4 Ds: diversity, density, to generate discovery, and development. Without going too deeply into what a normative standard consistent with promoting creative discovery would look like, I'll just say that it would focus on whether the rules of the game empower creativity, more so than trying to prevent the gales of dark destruction. The focus would be on what keeps creation ahead of destruction, and definitely not on how closely the outcomes we can measure match the ideal outcomes that we can imagine. Viewing cities as spontaneous orders and not as works of art helps to explain the trade-off, I think, between scale and order, as well as the role of time in softening the severity of that trade-off. Complexity and creativity are at odds with scale and the comprehensiveness of design, because increasing scale impinges on the action spaces where creative informal contact tends to happen. Design might complement that informal contact to a point, but beyond a fairly low level, it begins to overwhelm it. Again, small is not always beautiful, and big is sometimes unavoidable. That makes it all the more important to understand the impact of scale and design on spontaneous orders. That applies as much to private as it does to public projects. When the designs are small relative to the surrounding social milieu, the downside of the trade-off isn't very steep. The problems start when budget constraints are soft and projects become mega projects, and mega projects become giga projects. I don't want to sound ideological. Jane Jacobs somehow avoided being ideological pigeonholed her entire life. But soft budget constraints are mainly the domain of governmental and especially of so-called public-private developments. Those elephantine architectural wonder complexes that too often strive for off-the-charts wow factors. Without legal privileges, subsidies, and eminent domain, could the scale and degree of design of purely privately funded developments even begin to compare to those? I don't think so. The rules of the game of urban processes interact in complex ways, so deliberately changing some of those rules to achieve a particular outcome is akin to trying to impose a particular design on the social order, killing the social order in the process, although perhaps preserving the appearance of life. Taxidermy again. That, by the way, is why I have problems with landmarks preservation on the scale practiced in many major cities today, including New York. And I live in a neighborhood, Brooklyn Heights, which is the first landmarks neighborhood in the state of New York. It's a beautiful place, but it's like a museum with restaurants. I worry that we pay lip service to mixed uses and density and diversity without really understanding exactly what these mean and how they are important for economic development and liveliness. Jacob explained how a living city fosters economic development and liveliness. For her, the two go together, by promoting the diversity of land use and skills, knowledge, and tastes. A government can't build an entire city, or neighborhood even, because it can only go so far in constructing that kind of diversity and the self-regulating processes that emerge from it. But in the ordinary course of its activities, a government can at least refrain from doing the things that would thwart the emergence of the invisible social infrastructure that give rise to that diversity, development, and liveliness. And because I'm afraid they won't refrain, I worry that when planners propose fixes for traffic, poverty, crime, discrimination, pollution, obesity, economic ennui, or whatever, they do so without seeing or caring about the things that constitute what Kenichi Sasaki calls a city's urban tactility, another part of the fine structure of society that is the result of human action, but not of human design. So I end with this final thought. The more precise and comprehensive and accurate your image of a city is, the less likely that the place you're imagining really is a city. A city is not a man-made thing.